Good morning. Welcome to Focus on the News. We're rejoined by John Tigges, our great co-host here, and in the background we've got Jose Vega, who is very much an activist up in New York, and he's been doing some wild things that we'll hear about later. But he's a real thorn in the side for the liberals up there and the warmongers. So, John, welcome back here.
Yeah, great to be here, sir. And lots going on all over the place in the news. But one of the biggest threats we're seeing right now, a lot of folks are starting to get concerned that we might have World War III and maybe even a nuclear exchange because of Putin getting backed into a corner. In the last week, we got a chance to see their bridge being blown up going into the Crimea, primary source of moving troops and support and food and all sorts of other things. And so a lot of folks now are going, man, we are between that and the pipeline being blown up, Putin's being backed into a corner, and his maybe only move is to launch a tactical nuke to try to reestablish their position. Some folks are speaking out against this. We got Elon Musk even calling for peace. But the biggest voice in the last week has been Donald Trump. You want to talk about what all of these big voices and the move to peace might be doing for actually seeing a peace deal?
Yeah, President Trump probably speaks with the largest voice of anybody in the United States right now. He was not sworn into office as the president. So he's the former president, I suppose you say. But in any event, he's the only political figure who can routinely go out and get 25,000 people to come together and get fired up about. So he was out in Mesa, Arizona. This is October the 10th. And he made a call. He said, we need immediate negotiations to prevent World War III. Now, he recognizes that World War III is looming. He recognizes that the consequences. And so he's called on Russia and Ukraine to start immediate negotiations. He says, otherwise the crisis may turn into World War III and cause global destruction. Now, you may recall that 2 months after Russia crossed the border, Russia and Ukraine had sat down and they had hammered out a framework for peace. There were details to be hashed out, but they were making very good progress, and it looked as though peace would emerge when Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, flew unexpectedly to Kiev and blew the whole peace deal up. He said, look, clearly he made it clear that not only the UK, but the United States were against peace, and they wanted this war to continue. And so the war has continued, and tens of thousands of young Ukrainian and Russian kids have been put off in this meat grinder. The United States, had we said we didn't want the war to continue, the war would have ended. Tens of thousands of lives would have been saved. But in any event, so Trump is calling for peace, and he says now we've got a war between Russia and Ukraine with potentially hundreds of thousands of people dying. Now, he's not talking about the ones that have already died. It's not nearly in that category. There are tens of thousands that have died, not hundreds. But he's looking to the future. He's saying, here's what's going to happen. And he says we need immediate negotiations for a peaceful end, or we will end up in World War III. And he says there will never be a war like this. He said we've never had a war like this. And it's all because of stupid people that don't have a clue. I can imagine some of the ones he's talking about. And he says it's because of the kind of weaponry that's available today. We've never had weapons like this. the destructive capability of modern weapons. And then he goes on, he says, look, he says, yeah, we've had all of this combat, but he says, don't forget that Putin has a second layer, a very powerful layer, and we have to be very smart and very nimble. We have to know what to say and what to do. And we are saying exactly the wrong thing. We'll end up in a World War III. There will be nothing left of our planet, he added. So he is very concerned. This isn't just some theoretical game that we're playing. I think we may have been the first ones to warn of the danger of nuclear war on this podcast on Focus on the News. But now the message is spreading. People are beginning to say, my gosh, we're for something that doesn't involve the United States at all, or shouldn't, on the other side of the globe, potentially 60% of all of mankind will die in a matter of a couple of weeks. And for what? If Boris Johnson had kept his frizzy-haired self out of the whole thing and hadn't blown up the peace agreement, you'd have had peace. People could have gone back to work. You wouldn't have had all the destruction, all the death.
Well, it's funny that you talk about and Trump calls people stupid, but there's another group of people that think that they're being sneaky smart, that this is exactly what they want to have happen. They want to have a cataclysmic, destructive war. Killing off humans is not a problem for those people. And then B, it allows for the establishment of a global government and a whole new big time reset, to quote Klaus Schwab. Do you think there's any truth in that?
Yeah, I caught the same thing. I think Donald Trump was being a little bit diplomatic when he said that they were just stupid. They're not stupid. They're evil. These people are really demonic. I call them the boys from Davos. They're the globalists, and a big element of that is the ones that come together under the World Economic Forum. They're not the only ones, but they're part of the link in the chain. Right now, there is this emerging global government. Herbert Walker Bush talked about it when he said we're going to create a new world order. Joe Biden mentioned it again early in this, where he's talking about the same thing, this one world order. The one world order is designed to so separate the peoples of the world from their government that the people will have utterly no voice, utterly no rights. There's been talk about, well, people will have no property and they'll like it. They won't own anything. They'll like it. It sounds an awful lot like the old communist dream of the future.
And that worked out really, really well, by the way.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, it's nutso that we're at this point, and at least some people on the left are recognizing it. In the last 24 hours, has been a huge story break in that Tulsi Gabbard, who actually ran for president as a Democrat, got to the point now that she stated that she can no longer remain in today's Democratic Party that is now under the complete control of an elitist cabal of warmongers driven by cowardly wokeness who divide us by racializing every issue and stoke anti-white racism, actively work to undermine our God-given freedoms, are hostile to people of faith and spirituality, demonize the police and protect criminals at the expense of law-abiding Americans, believe in open borders, weaponize national security state to go after political opponents, and above all, dragging us even closer to nuclear war. She gets it, and she actually has said that she's leaving the Democratic Party. She doesn't say where she's going, but I think she may actually see a lot of people go with her. What do you make of this move, sir?
This is a very big deal. Tulsi Gabbard is the final fragment of the moderates within the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is made up of almost uniformly Marxist-leaning, extreme leftists who really are driving us towards class warfare based on racial distinctions. I wrote a letter to every member of Congress some years ago. This is when I was early on in the Senate, but I had been studying the war in Syria actually before it even began. So I followed the entire thing, and so I wrote a letter to the members of Congress explaining how the United States was an unwavering supporter of Al-Qaeda, and how the Syrian army had just won a major campaign where they had rescued 13 Catholic nuns who had been held human hostage by Al-Qaeda and their affiliates. Anyway, so I wrote this letter to each. It was tailored to each one, and the only one that really gave a coherent response was Tulsi Gabbard. And she obviously knew precisely what was going on in Syria. She knew in detail what was happening. It was stunning to me, quite honestly,
Well, she actually visited the war zone as a congressman. One of the only few people that actually went in there.
She did. And I was so impressed. I looked and I thought, here's a Democrat Congress, and she's the one who understands what's going on. I was so impressed by her. I've never done this before. I've sent thousands of letters over my career. I wrote her a second time just to tell her how impressive her letter was. And she has continued. She knows more about foreign policy than I think anybody in the U.S. Congress today. I really hope that if it's Donald Trump who becomes president, he needs to have a very substantial position in his administration for her. But
some were talking yesterday, maybe vice president. What do you think of that combination?
I would be fine with it. Anybody who looks at her Twitter, she did a personal presentation. I wish we could show it. Jose Vega will be getting us online with things like that shortly. But I would advise everybody, listen to that. You will hear the most clear-spoken, most articulate, most insightful individual you could imagine. And if she were the vice president, I'd say hallelujah. I would be so pleased to see that.
So let me ask you this. She's actually one of the people listed under Klaus Schwab's World Economic Forum, Young Future Leaders, whatever it's called. And a lot of folks are like, uh-oh, watch out, coming in under the radar, controlled opposition. What do you make of that?
No, I don't think there's not a chance in the world. She has really fallen on her sword for peace, for humanity. She has stood on the right side. She lived with some of the democratic ideals that were there, but she has been so much on the outs. She was one of the presidential contenders, but the mainstream media, they knew that she did not favor these global imperial wars, and they hardly gave her a chance to speak. Had she spoken, she would have been the Democratic nominee for president, because even the Democrats would have said, yeah, this person really knows what she's talking about.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, it's not clear what she's apparently in an independent mode right now, but that would be a very interesting, powerful punch, Trump and Gabbard for 24. Let's see what happens there. But the one thing that we are seeing what's happened is the perversion is not ending. we're continuing to see not in schools. The perversion just keeps getting lower and lower. Right here in Virginia, in Chesterfield, excuse me. They just found a boy in kindergarten that went home with a book pushing for trans rights for girls. What's it going to take to stop this? How many times do parents have to say, we had an issue with pushing this trans agenda at the youngest layers, in any layer, without them knowing about it? Where does this go from here? How in the world does this crazy perversion stop?
Well, this is an interesting story. This is out of Chesterfield County, right here in Virginia, which is here we are in Loudoun County, the epicenter of the uprising against it. You were arrested for exercising your First Amendment rights to peaceful assembly, to freedom of speech, to freedom of religion, and so it's been very exciting here. Well, it's not only in Virginia, it's all across the country. Now, this is a little confusing because this is actually it's a transvestite publication about a girl. The media switches. Whatever somebody calls themselves, they begin to use that pronoun for them. So this is actually a girl, and she comes home with a book that says, "I'm not a girl." And her father, obviously went kind of crazy over this, and there's no parental consent required. She comes home. She's a 5-year-old. She's a 5-year-old, and here you have her bringing home a sex book about perverse sexual activities. And this is from Mosley Elementary School. So anybody going to Mosley needs to be standing out there with some flyers and needs to be confronting some people and calling for the firing of the principal of that school, who's obviously an incompetent boob. Anybody who would allow this kind of thing to go on it's just disgusting. Do problem we've got? The public educational achievements are in a state of collapse in the United States. We've gone from where children would graduate with 12 years of public education to where now they're graduating with maybe 10 and a half years of public schooling, because they all went home for the flu, for the COVID, and they just stopped teaching for a couple of years. And the test scores are just, going down the toilet. And so here we are. And what's the focus of public schools? The focus is on teaching children perverse sexual activity, not reading, writing, arithmetic. The focus is on inciting anti-white hatred, not reading, writing, and arithmetic. And they're just destroying a whole generation of children who are growing up without the fundamental educational tools to function in a civilized world. So let's see. The book is put out by Macmillan Publishers, and they touted "I'm Not a Girl." They said it's an empowering story, a true story about a little girl who is determined to be himself. A little girl who is determined to be himself. See how they use these things. Allegedly, the book was co-authored by a 12-year-old girl who had some sort of distortion of her body to transition to be a boy. I hope it didn't involve female genital mutilation. It may have involved hormones. It may have involved some breast destruction. It's hideous stuff, and because they do these things permanently to themselves, they have a horrific level of suicide. I mean, it's just astronomical. But it's a mess. And the good news, I think, is that these people are on the back foot. There's no doubt. They're in retreat. People are challenging them in the races for school board. They're looking now at the boards of supervisors and the board of commissioners in some states, where they're saying, okay, you guys are the ones who fund the schools, so maybe you need to go. If you're putting up with this kind of stuff, like, we've got Phyllis Randall here, our chairman of the board, who's famously going around ripping down statues for a living, and funding all of this perversion, all of this decadence, all of this critical race theory, racial hatred, and so forth. Those people need to be in a situation where they can't just walk away unscathed and say, oh, that's the school board doing it. No, it isn't. The money comes from the board of supervisors. They need to be held accountable.
No, completely agree. My solution is,
what's that? You would have some good ones.
No, it's simple. It's school choice. It's what they're doing in Arizona. It's doing in other places. The public school system is so full of corrupt people intent on an agenda that is just un-Christian and un-American. The only option is you fund the student, not the system, and the system will die without funding, because there's very, very few parents who are in support of this, and those that are probably need some additional help themselves. I mean, it's just sick, and it goes against just the basic understanding of humanity to take the way you were born biologically and surgically change it, and then know that most of the people that do that struggle the rest of their lives with what they've done. There was a viral, I guess, I don't know if whatever it was a video that I saw on Twitter. 21-year-old female who had transitioned while still a teenager, and I'll call her she's a she, but she definitely looks like a guy. She's balding from all the testosterone treatments. She's actually looking a lot older than 21. She's got a deep voice, and it's permanent. She can't change it back, and she's going to deal with that the rest of her life. It's horrific. And just because someone's confused when they're going through puberty, or in this case, you confuse them when they're in kindergarten and screw them up for the rest of their life, thinking that that they maybe are something different than they are. It's nutso. I think Bill Maher said it best. And I'm not a fan of Big Maher most of the time, but this actually is a pretty funny analogy. He says, just because I wanted to be a pirate when I was 6, thank God nobody poked an eye out and cut one of my legs off so that I could be a pirate. I mean, it's just ridiculous what we're doing to children. It's got to stop. And I think the only solution is you got to give parents an alternative. And a lot of parents have an alternative. I mean, we homeschool all of our kids. We saw this back in the 80s, what was coming, and we said we're going to go a different route. But those that can't, the single moms, the people that just don't have another alternative, they need school choice. That's going to give them an out to get out of this mess called public schools. It's fundamentally broken. And as long as you got guys like Scott Ziegler and the Phyllis Randalls and the people that support them in place, pushing this awful, perverted agenda, it's not going to change. Anyway.
I agree with that. And I've got 16 grandchildren, none of them in public school. None of them have spent one day in public schools. And I've got, the oldest two just, went into very, very fine universities. But why? They think clearly. They think rationally. They know how to add, subtract. They have an immense vocabulary and so forth. They're smart kids. But the most important thing for a culture is to have decent kids.
Yeah.
And I taught homeschool classes during the COVID craziness where they sent children home who were at zero risk of anything. And we didn't wear masks. We didn't take vaccines. We didn't do any of that stuff. And the kids learned. They'll remember a lot of the things that they learned in the classes that we held. But on this issue of the transgenderism in the public schools, we need some legislative fixes. And I think one of the things, we need a constitutional amendment at the state level that says that sexual matters will not be taught or discussed in public schools. Just make it illegal. You cannot tell me there is a sound justification for teaching children. I don't care if they're 12th grade. Why should 12th graders be learning about sexual depravity instead of learning about calculus and trigonometry? If you put in one, you're taking out the other. And so we need to have a constitutional amendment that forbids sexual matters being discussed or presented. And then we need to make it a serious felony for anyone to participate in the sexual mutilation of a boy or a girl. And we need to give the boy or the girl the ability to sue any person who was complicit in that crime. Once the boy or girl reaches the age of 18, they can sue their parents if the parents were involved. They can sue the Uber driver who took them there knowingly, if he knew. They can sue the physician, the surgeon who mutilated and destroyed them. And I mean, there's no limit. And we should encourage the trial bar, sick all of the lawyers on these people who are destroying the lives of these people. We need some legal protections for these little children who can't protect themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great legal solution, but until that happens, every parent that's out there, you have the freedom right now to take your kids out of that system. Just like Tulsi left the Democratic Party, you got to leave the public school system. If you can in any way do it, you need to do it, whether it's private school, homeschool, co-op. You made a great point, Senator, that virtue is probably the biggest missing element that it's not even dealt with in public schools anymore because it's not allowed, right? And until we teach kids virtue and character, all the calculus and trigonometry in the world isn't going to do them any good. And that's what they're not getting in the public schools. And that instead they're actually being indoctrinated with perversion. That's the saddest thing. And we're seeing the effects of it across America, an entire generation of children that no longer even have a concept of what is right and what's wrong. But we're going to end on my truth. And unless you got anything else to say, sir, I think we're hitting our 30 minutes.
Okay, good. Well, thank you all for joining us at Focus on the News. We will be back with you in a couple of days here. And anyway, until then, keep the faith. This has been Dick Black, Focus on the News.